August is Love and Rockets month. While I'm on summer vacation, we flash back to 4 vintage episodes where the topic was Gilbert and Jaime Hernandez Love and Rockets comics. This week, Kumar and I are joined by comics maven Tom Spurgeon to focus on the work of Jaime Hernandez, specifically the books Maggie the Mechanic, The Girl from Hoppers, and Perla La Loca. It's episode 300 from October 24th, 2011. Enjoy.
This is Tim.
And this is Kumar.
This is Tom Spurgeon, special guest, I guess, of Tim and Kumar.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is the 300th episode. This is Tim in Tokyo, and along with Kumar, we've got a special guest, Tom Spurgeon, former editor of Comics Journal and current blogger at comicsreporter.com. How are you doing?
I'm doing just great. I hope I didn't ruin the introduction.
That's fine. That's why there's editing. So our topic this week is the Love and Rockets work of Jaime Hernandez. We'll do Gilbert Hernandez again in a future episode, but we're focusing on Jaime this time. And now,
can I say I really appreciate that? You know, because I think a lot of times those guys get lumped in together as if they're two heads on the same body. And I really appreciate that you guys are taking both of them as individuals and looking at their work, because they really are, individual cartoonists.
Sure. Well, and also it's too much reading to do for one episode. It spreads out the reading.
Well, I've got the pile of books on my desk is the biggest I've ever had for an episode. I've got like 5 volumes plus the 3 issues that just came out, so...
it's pretty staggering. I mean, if you just think about the fact that those guys have been around and producing at such a high quality for 30 years now, and that's an astonishing thing. It's an astonishing thing for comics. There are very few cartoonists, You start talking about your Kirbys and your Charles Schultzes when you start talking about guys that have been kind of at the top of their game for as long as the brothers have, and Jaime. Specifically, it's like an amazing thing to have been, that prolific and that good.
So, Tom, you worked at Fantagraphics. Were you involved in the publishing of the Love and Rocket stuff at all, or just in Comics Journal?
No, they kept me far away from that stuff. I was down in the basement next to all the pornographic books at a tiny desk. With the office, we had like one computer in the office at the time, I think, in '94 when I started working there. And it was very cold, I remember that, and it was very wet. And no, the closest I came, I did do some reprint work for them, where I helped compile the early unsuccessful versions of the Pogo books they did, and then did Little Orphan Annie and some stuff like that. But mostly they just kept me angrily denouncing the comics industry for the entire time I was there, rather than getting near the good stuff. One thing that was really cool, though, is that if you work at a place like that, you do get to see like original art coming in all the time, and that was always a wonderful thing. Like if you were there late at night and you were bored, I might sneak up to the art department and go through, the next issue that was coming out, or just look at some of those cartoonists, and especially someone like Jaime, whose the originals were just so beautiful. And that was always a real treat.
So now, both Kumar and Tom, you have, I guess, pretty long experience with reading the stuff. Is that right, Kumar?
Yeah, but I didn't start at the beginning when it was first coming out. But I've read all of it. But I mean, I think you have to, like any comic book that you come into that's had a long history. It's best once you're in, you want to go back to the start. And start from the beginning. But no, I didn't start reading until well into the 90s, mid-90s or something.
The reason I ask is because I had not read any of this stuff until preparing for this episode.
Wow.
So, and what I read were these three books that had came out from Fantagraphics fairly recently: Maggie the
Vibrant.
Mechanic and The Girl from Hoppers and Perla la Loca.
Yeah, I think that takes you up to about 96 or 97.
Yeah, but now I think that I these books are not like complete, right? They're just kind of a best of.
No, they're supposed to be complete.
They're pretty complete. They might be missing one or two random things that they did here and there, but I think they're pretty complete. I honestly don't know.
Okay, well, the reason I say that is it seemed like, and maybe that's just the way that Jaime did it, but it seemed like things were missing, or it seemed like we were suddenly jumping ahead into a different status quo.
Sure. That's been his kind of narrative strategy over the years, is he kind of tells specific stories set in a time period, and then he'll kind of move the whole thing forward a few years to a kind of a new baseline, and then tell another story set in that time period. So, you have that time period where Hopi and Maggie are hanging out, and then you have that time period where, Hopi's gone, and then you have a time period, and, even now there's a time period where Maggie is a apartment manager, which is kind of distinct from all the others. But you're right, he does jump forward, 3 or 4 years in the characters' lives, pretty much every 6 or 7 issues of the comic, or every few stories.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And in fact, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, in the later volume that you haven't read, I think it's 4 or 5, he retcons in this ex-boyfriend with pretty, for Maggie, with really pretty dramatic consequences.
Is everybody hearing that, or is that just me?
When I read it the first time, I was like, oh my God, I failed as a reader. I missed something really, really important somewhere. But it wasn't. He'd actually just kind of added it in without without us really realizing it.
I guess, yeah, there were places like, now this is in Perla la Loca, but the third book, about Esther's haircut. And, we never saw anything like that happen. I guess it was sort of forced upon her to get her haircut, but we never actually saw that happen. So I was like, did we miss something here? Or I guess
actually, the haircuts are sometimes an indicator of passage of time. You can tell when you're in a different time period by the different hairstyles.
Right, yeah. And, yeah, that's sometimes that's the only way you can... I mean, like, he has a lot of flashbacks in here, but there's never any kind of effects done or anything with the panel shape or anything, so you just have to kind of figure it out.
No, he's pretty ruthless when it comes to that. He is. And it helps that he can draw. He can flat out draw. He's one of the best artists, I think, ever to work in comics. And you can tell from, the faces and the figures and once you orient yourself to it. But if you're used to a big fat meanwhile up in the upper left-hand corner, or 8 days ago or 6 years ago, it can be pretty astonishing. Mm-hmm. Kumar can tell you this, but he has always kind of then gone back in his later stories and done stories set in those earlier times to kind of fill in the blanks. He just did a story in this latest one where Maggie, I think, is in her early 40s now, but he goes back to when she's 11 and 13 years old and tells a fairly significant pair of stories in the last couple of issues in that time period. So he will jump around, and I'm not sure. That's something you can do with comics. You don't have to recast or find new people to play a younger version. You can just draw it that way. But he does take advantage of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I felt like I had to pay pretty close attention, or else I would start to think like, oh, these are different characters or something. Like, no. And then Maggie has like 5 different names too, and that makes it difficult.
I hadn't thought about that. You're exactly right. Yeah,
because
I think it's actually, I think it's better. I think it's better to read it over 20 years. I think the part of the problem is, reading them in 4 weeks is, the stories take place over 20 years. I think it's a bit easier to orient yourself into those gaps if you read it over from the beginning to the end over a long time. Because it's like sometimes people in your life, they come in and out of your life and you see them again a few years later or whatever. It's closer to that kind of experience than I almost think reading them in these trade paperbacks is almost the worst format. It's almost better to get the issues and just read them a couple times each before you clock up to the next one.
Maybe, although, I mean, there are times when he refers back to stuff that happened 10 years ago and finally explains it, and I think if you're reading it in real time, I think you'd forget about that stuff by the time he explained it.
Sure. Well, I don't know if there's a bad way to read that stuff. One of the things about Jaime's jumping around, or his kind of this kind of broad canvas that he works on, is that one of his explicit themes is about the power of memory and the hold that memory has over our current decisions, especially if if there's a time in your life that you idealize as kind of a special time, and how that can kind of change the way you look at the present. So it does kind of fit into a lot of one of the major themes, if not the major theme of his work overall.
Yeah. True.
Should we start at the beginning?
Okay, that sounds like a good idea. Now that we're 10 minutes in, so I guess that the title comes from the fact that in these early stories there are actually rockets along with love, and also dinosaurs.
Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff very early on, and some people prefer those stories.
Yeah.
To this day. To this day, you'll get an angry man with a beard and a ponytail saying that Jaime never should have left the dinosaurs behind.
I know, but he changed his art style too, and he had a very heavily rendered art style in the beginning. It seems like he must have been a huge influence on like Mark Schultz and all those illustrative guys. Even I felt like he was even influencing Steve Rude in some way. He was so the themes, the art, and everything. It was really, and he seemed to be doing it before any of those other guys were doing it.
Yeah, I think so. They all kind of draw from the same sources, and I think because they're still working now, it's sometimes hard to totally recall, when they started out, and that they're of a generation that grew up reading comics in the 60s, that they have a lot of real mainstream comics values, and they're not, they're very strong draftsmen, both brothers, and Jaime in particular. See, I'm doing it too. I'll talk about them as if they're one person. But, Jaime in particular has a very strong, and he draws on a kind of wide range of comics from the 60s, everything from the Archie comics to Dennis the Menace to, classic kind of adventure illustration and Toth and Kirby. There's a lot of Kirby and even Ditko in his work, because that's what he was reading, and that's kind of his value base. It's kind of these classic, guys who could flat out draw.
Yeah. And
so you did get a lot of guys in that generation of the 80s that kind of drew from those same sources and kind of all, drew from each other. Steve Rude and his commercial art Jones of the 20s and 30s, and Mark Schultz with the kind of classic fantasy illustrator. They're all kind of drawing from that same kind of back when craft was important and it had to look just right, and it wasn't about expressing yourself in a line as much as getting it down.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Archie, because I was noticing, especially as we kind of got into the middle, into Girl from Hoppers, the art would reference that kind of stuff a lot, and actually I saw a guy in there in House of Raging Women who appeared to be Archie.
Yeah,
Gilbert did that. One of the yeah, and anytime they're like, even when they're walking around Hoppers, it's just like Archie walking around Riverdale. Like you get that vibe, and the story structures, and even the latest 3 issues, all that superhero stuff is just like the Archie. They did that superhero stuff once in a while, where all their characters would fly around as superheroes for a bit. He's still doing it, 20, 30 years later.
Yeah. Now for me, having reading this for the first time, like the first half of the first book of Maggie the Mechanic was kind of rough going, I thought. I had trouble getting into it at first. The second half of the book I enjoyed it, because it gets to be kind of straight comedy in the second half. Or at least it felt that way to me. In the other two books, it starts to get a little bit more serious, or it kind of goes back and forth. Comedy or serious, or mixing the two, or comedy forms in the comedy art style in the service of a more serious story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was going to say, yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair assessment. I think that a lot of that is they were the brothers were kind of feeding off each other, and Gilbert had made this really serious turn towards in his material towards these kind of magic realist type stories, and I think that they kind of have always kind of bounced off one another in terms of tone and kind of the intent of what their stories were doing. So I think that had an influence on him, and I think he just got more interested and more comfortable with doing a certain kind of setting and a certain kind of story rather than a kind of the drawing kind of the wacky dinosaurs and the spaceships and the mechanical stuff. So I just think he just kind of, his interest has kind of developed as he grew into his 20s, and you end up with that material of the second half of the book where he really kind of started to find his feet tonally, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What do you think
a lot
about
of it is funny, and people forget that too.
Mm. What do you think about him? He kind of wholesalely rejects the mechanics stuff. Later on, it's kind of interesting because did you read the Tim Kreider article about Cerebus in the last issue of the Journal? And he talks about how Dave Sim got stuck with this aardvark that goes through all these story arcs that didn't have to be there, where he didn't have to be in the stories. He wasn't adding anything to it. And I felt like he cut off the mechanics stuff, but in every edition we've had of these collections, there's always those mechanics stories at the beginning. And I'm kind of wondering, why didn't Jaime just restart? Because Gilbert restarted. He had Luba and earlier stories, but then he just you never see those stories reprinted. He just kind of restarted with kind of the same character designs and names, but put them into new situations.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I don't know if anyone's ever asked him, just face to face, why he did it, why he's gone with this strategy rather than the other strategy. I think he's done it gracefully, and I think that there are hints that it's a part of kind of the process of memory, but he also has kind of fantasy or fantastic elements right up until the modern stuff that he's doing now. You'll occasionally see someone in a superhero outfit, or something like that, or there'll be hints of the old days. But I just think that I wonder if it isn't just a kind of a rejection of that really rigid fan mentality of this has to make sense, where he just kind of drifts to where the story tells him to go, and the other stuff is what it was, and if it doesn't quite match up, it doesn't quite match up.
Well, there's something, like the H.R. Costigan stuff. Later on, he seems to almost avoid that character, and I'm like, is he avoiding him because of the horns on his head? And then later on, he explains that as some sort of calcium deformity in his head. Like, he retcons this kind of scientific explanation for it.
Yeah.
It was it's a bit funny because I never really know whether is he gonna be on this the straight path, or are we suddenly gonna see some character turn into a giant or something. You never really know what he's gonna hit you with a couple stories down the line.
No, and I like that aspect of it too. I mean, I like kind of not knowing how much of that stuff or how to pay attention to it. I think it almost settles more comfortably into the background of the comic for it not being all explained away, or sometimes explained away, or maybe this works and maybe this is true and maybe this isn't, or maybe it's just the way memory works. So I don't know. It's an interesting strategy. It's certainly all his own. It's certainly not like Dave's kind of the way he kind of pulled the stuff with him as he went into different areas. So I think that's something that someone should ask him. Really, come on, Jaime.
I noticed as I went on, he starts to take some stories, not always, but he'll have some stories where they're kind of jump cuts, and he'll show like a piece of action here and a piece of action there. And when he first started doing that, I found it really hard to follow. Later, I think he gets a better hold on that technique, but Like, I had to read Death of Speedy Oritz a couple times before I understood what was going on.
Okay. What was the confusing part for you in that one?
Well, I guess I was losing track of which characters were what, and he doesn't lay it out for you. You have to kind of really pay attention and see, right, like, this person, oh, is that person? Okay, and there he is again, and that's who they were talking about there. And Tear It Up, Tear It Down, I found to be the most confusing story. I still don't understand it. But then when he starts to do the same thing later, like in Wigwam Bam, which I think was my favorite one, or Bob Richardson, then I didn't get nearly as lost. I knew what was going on, but it was still kind of that same, jumping around technique.
Tom, do you know was he doing Wigwam Bam at the same time that Gilbert was doing Poison River?
Yeah, it was.
There's a similar narrative strategy with that fast cutting, and you only get a couple of panels of people in scenes, and everybody's in different places.
And I think it might be one of those things where it's a little. It is it might be easier to follow those stories specifically when you've been living with the characters for 15 years as opposed to 15 days a little bit. And I think I think that. And I think that's a nice thing. It's something that's very admirable about Jaime is that, in reading his latest stuff, I had this thought when so many times when we talk about comics, we kind of talk about ideal audiences or who they should appeal to, and I think that one thing that's really admirable about him is I don't think he's ever really cared that much to kind of spoon feed his audience a little bit. Yeah. I don't know if that's the punk rock background, but he's kind of like, here it is. And if it's something that connects with you, it does, and if it doesn't, well, then that story wasn't for you. But I think, Tim, I also think you're right in that as he's gotten older, he's become a better cartoonist, and he does use certain effects more effectively than he did when he was kind of first introducing them. So
yeah, and I pity the fool who picks up Perla Loca first, because I don't know what. If you be able, I think you have to kind of start at the beginning and wade through the dinosaur and rocket stuff and get to this point and have that background.
I think it helps, although I think Kumar just said he didn't start until the mid '90s, and I didn't really start until I kind of bought it out of duty because you kind of did that back then. You had to buy Love and Rocket, and then it kind of fell on me like a wall of bricks with Death of Speedy, and at that point I just started. And there's also a story that Gilbert told around the same time called For the Love of Carmen, and at that point it was just a mad scramble to get the back issues so that I could, or I think there were trades at that time, to kind of figure out what was going on. So I think it does. You do get the full story if you read the full story, to coin a kind of inane saying, but I do think that you can kind of find something appealing, and then all of a sudden it'll hit, and you go back scrambling or looking to see. And in that way, it kind of has something of similar qualities of superhero literature or other kind of serial comic books over the years, where you kind of fall right into the middle of the story and find yourself scrambling to find out what happened before.
Well, I think this is even more so that way than a lot of superhero stories, because it's the same writer all the way through, and and he's constantly building on what happened before. So yeah, I think it's even harder to come in the middle than it would be in Spider-Man.
Yeah, and you'll find often that you'll go. I know that I find when I read it is that you'll think, oh my goodness, who is that again? And you'll go back and you'll read something, and it's like, wow, he mentioned Speedy like 7 issues before we saw Speedy. Or, he had Yaks from the Mechanics days in one of the recent stories. You're like, oh yeah, who is that? And then you go back and read, that's Yaks from the Mechanics days. So you're constantly kind of, it does exist and it does have a pretty high, but you're constantly discovering things like that. It is a very highly textured world that he's kind of portraying.
I think it's deceptive how simplistic it looks and sounds, but almost every line of dialogue is packed with something which might end up getting unpacked, somewhere down the line. It's quite amazing how dense it is without appearing to be.
Sure. Yeah, there was a great moment. There was a moment in one of the recent stories for about 3 or 4 years ago where Maggie was waiting to hear, I love you from someone.
Yeah.
And that had a lot of resonance when you read these latest issues and you get to the point where Maggie says that to someone else. And it's just like all of a sudden you realize, wow, that has a lot more resonance because of the groundwork that was laid in this other story. So he's very, he always, in the old days, it was always Gilbert the writer and Jaime the artist. But Gilbert's a really good artist, and Jaime's a very underrated writer, I think,
I agree.
Especially in terms of layering the story, over the years and kind of picking at certain things and developing these powerful themes.
Can you talk about reading Death of Speedy Ortiz when it came out versus reading it now?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any special quality to actually reading it then, or if that's just when it hit me. But I was about 20 years old. It's about the age of the characters when that material came out, and there was something about the very real kind of emotional setup of all the characters, where they were kind of, but it was also this kind of very highly romantic setting that was very different than middle of Indiana where I was, but this kind of perfect moment, or that moment in people's lives where you're kind of you're right between late teen and early adulthood, and you really don't have anything to do, and everything is so dramatic, and to actually depict a dramatic moment. Just something about that just hit me, like with like a ton of bricks. And I'm not really exactly sure what it was. I think it had to have been partly just that sheer romantic quality of that storyline. That there was, it's almost shameless in terms of like some of those last effects and the way it flashes back to them as little kids, and the way that Speedy says goodbye to his loved ones and that kind of silent. It's almost. That's just like teenage, eat that kind of stuff up with a spoon at that age. It's just he's so beautiful and seems so meaningful. But, I just think it was just seeing these kind of emotional truths played out in this completely different setting that, it was, all of a sudden I was relating to, lesbian characters in the greater Los Angeles County area more than I was, anything else I was reading at that time. And that was a really astonishing thing. And it's a very beautiful comic. I've probably said that in 3 or 4 different ways, but I think I just responded to that being so beautiful, too, at the time. Yeah. But, man, I must have read that, like, 30 times, just like that, every day that summer, with being, like, 20 or 21 years old, and just adored that. It just hit me just so hard that I was a lifelong fan after that, for sure.
What do you think is his sort of purpose in having the really cartoony elements? There are several places where he employs, I know it's probably one of Kumar's favorite things in comics as well as mine, where people react to something by falling backwards and only their feet are sticking into the panel. And they're in... and I think it's in Wigwam Bam and around that era when he shows these kids. The kids look really cartoony.
Right. They're like Hank Ketchum kids. They're like they're like Dennis the Menace and his kids. I just think that's part of his. I think that's just pure, flat out his aesthetic sensibility. I don't think it's a considered effect. I don't think he's like, I'm going to jack them up by having different styles. Kind of clashing on the page. I just think that the brothers learned how to do comics. Their comics reading when they were kids, they read a lot of comics, and they read the same comics over and over again. Their comics were kind of taken from them during the school year and then re-given to them during the summer. And they read a lot of the same and studied a lot of the same comics over and over again. And I think that kind of gives them a really they kind of absorbed a lot of these different art styles as just a way of communicating. I think it just seems natural to him that the kids look that different than the teens that look that different than a rendered style that look that different. I think that's a kind of the natural process of kind of accruing a style over several years and over a 16 or 20 great cartoonists that they liked at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think it's natural to him, and I do think you get a kind of, and I think he likes it. I just think he likes it. I think he likes that kind of lively, kind of loose cartoon effect that he gets that way.
Yeah, I think it worked a lot better with those kids than drawing them in the same style would have, in a way.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to agree with that and say I wouldn't even call it really a style. I think he enjoys drawing them that way, and I think he enjoys drawing the teens the way he draws them. He more than any other cartoonist, I feel like he enjoys drawing. It's not like a chore. For him, he seems to really enjoy being at the desk and drawing those figures the way he draws them.
I think that's a big part of it. I think he does like the act of drawing, and I think that they're very. He's a very proud cartoonist in that he very much values. There's nothing tossed off about his work. He very much likes doing it. I interviewed him once where I asked him about some of the freelance gigs that he's done over the years for various record, covers and things like that. And he almost expressed, spite towards these things because they were keeping him from his work. So he does, very much value that his work, his life's work, is kind of a vehicle for expression. And I don't think there's any thought in his mind of just not doing exactly what comes naturally and exactly what he finds the most pleasurable.
There were times in the stories where, how do I put this? I mean, I don't think it was intentional, but sometimes the many beautiful women in the stories and the amount of sex in it felt like he was sort of getting close to titillation, but I don't think that he really meant to. What do you think?
Well, I think he has I think he has an appreciation for cheesecake. I mean, it's certainly like Penny Century is a Vava Boom type character, and he does have an appreciation for women and body types that weren't always popular, and certainly weren't popular in the very aerobicized 1980s when he was introducing them. Mm-hmm. So I do think that there's a big element of that. I think he loves drawing women. I don't think it's there to titillate, but I think it comes out of his aesthetic sensibility and what he likes to draw and the fact that he likes being around women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not even because they're all different body types, and it's interesting that Maggie puts on the weight pretty early and kind of stays that way.
And there's a lot of letters at the time of people, castigating this decision. How dare you when does Maggie get skinny again? And the answer is never. It was, and so but I do think.
But everybody finds her attractive. Like everybody, as soon as she walks in, you're like, oh, like who's that? And it's almost, it's almost more tittillating than Vivian or Penny Century, in some ways.
But I do think he loves drawing those. I know he loves drawing Vivian, the frog mouth.
The first time, almost the first story where we see Maggie quite large, she walks across the street and her pant. It's a profile shot, and she's got all this cross hatching on her pants, and it's a total R. Crumb look. It's obvious he ripped off the cross hatching from Crumb. Just that one instant, and you don't really see it again. But it's quite funny how dramatic the change is early on.
Mm-hmm.
As far as like the depictions of sex, though, I don't know exactly where he's coming from with how he approaches that thing. I assume it's just naturally, or it just comes out of his natural desire to depict something or not depict something according to whatever his story wants. But I think that there was kind of a comics came from a weird place where comics for years had that kind of repressed censorious attitude towards anything kind of titillating, and then 10 years before Jaime started doing comics, you had the underground guys come up that did purposefully kind of went to show those things for the simple kind of glee in getting to show those things on the comics page. And I think that if you look at those comics as a group, I think that there are a lot of cartoonists that had difficulty kind of deciding what to show and how to show it, and how this would what kind of audience that they were going for. And I think in that context, Jaime didn't really have kind of those same difficult issues, but I think it's something that is very confusing to the time to a lot of cartoonists, for sure.
Mm.
Yeah, and then the relationship between Maggie and Hopi. I mean, when they're first introduced, there's sort of this rumor that they're lesbians, but we see no proof of that until much later, like into the second book. Then all of a sudden they're doing it, like they actually are lesbians.
Yeah, no, and that was very. I remember when that happened. That was a very people very much commented on that. Like finally you've kind of pulled the trigger, or how dare you pull that particular trigger, or depending on where people were coming from. But he did kind of, and one thing that is kind of to his. One of the things that makes him kind of the artist that he is that the nebulous nature of that relationship is one of the through lines through the book. In that, Maggie is obviously dated and lived with and is primarily attracted to men throughout the entire run of the books, and how they relate. The fact that their relationship isn't easily defined then became kind of a story element for the rest of the run till today.
Well, and I liked how it worked or how it was explained, because I mean, I've known women in real life who might have, a sexual relationship with one woman, but they're not turned on by women in general. It's that one particular person that they feel that way about, but otherwise maybe they're more oriented towards men.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great scene in Wigwam Bam where, I think it's in Wigwam Bam, either that's or it's right before it, where she kind of opts out of a sexual experience, just kind of feels uncomfortable after a while. So that's when you kind of got the idea that it was very, very specifically tied up into that one relationship, or mostly. I mean, she certainly has a sort of a relationship with the Frogmouth later on, but it's not, it's very complicated. It's very much about that character, and I think that's, if nothing else, Jaime really knows those characters. So,
yeah, I felt like he must have full backstories on all of them that he hasn't completely revealed in the actual comic.
What's interesting is he actually said of the two main characters, of Maggie and Hopi, that he knew Maggie, what she was like from being a baby until, 65 years old or whatever. But actually, Hopi was more of a mystery to him. And I think one of the reasons he kind of did a lot of stories about her in recent years is because he didn't really know where she was. He wasn't on as firm a ground with her as he was with Maggie. But Maggie is the constant. That's his North Star, obviously.
Yeah, in the first book, you don't see Hopi that much. It's really focused on Maggie.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, that I found a lot of the strongest stories were not about either of them. If you think about, like, The Death of Speedy or Spring 1982 or Flies on the Ceiling, they're all about secondary characters. But
Spring 1982 and Flies on the Ceiling are just titanic stories too. I mean, I don't have anything specific to say about them, but they are awesome stories. And a lot of those background characters, one of the things right now is that we don't know if Jaime is going to continue doing stories with these characters, because the most recent story suggests an ending. I don't know if it's an ending he'll take or if it's something he'll do for a while. And it just got me thinking. I mean, there are a lot of really, really good supporting characters. And, two of them being, just a good half dozen to a dozen supporting characters that, you would just follow off the page into their own comics. He has a lot of Peppermint Patties, and not just one, where Schultz did Peppermint Patty, where you kind of thought she was in her own strip for a while, that was in another neighborhood. Jaime has a lot of characters like that. Yeah. Even someone like Terry Down, I mean, that's a fascinating character, Texas, Antonio, is another character from later on that doesn't make a lot of appearances, but I would gladly read an entire comic about them. And he actually spent some time in this latest issue talking about Letty, who was Maggie's friend when she was 13 years old, and gave us a story from her perspective. So,
well, I found every time I read a story of Ray D, my hands would like grip the comic tighter. Like, those are the ones I was most into. And when he starts that relationship with Danita, I really, really wanted that to work. And then it kind of doesn't. And he ends up in that weird relationship with Vivian. And I was just as interested, even though, because it was so weird and it was going to end in some sort of disaster.
Listen to yourself, Kumar. I mean, that's the great thing about these stories. If they end up appealing to you and you kind of dive into them, you really do start having just that natural soap opera reaction. My brother still makes fun of me because there was a scene where two characters get in a fist fight, and I actually called my brother on the phone and said, these two guys got into a fist fight, and hung up. Like they were real people, like they were our friends that got into a fist fight out in the street. I was like, oh, dude, he fought this dude, and I hung up. And like, this is ridiculous. But of course, that's the power of good art. That's the power of really good serial soap operas, is that you become invested in these relationships, and you want them to succeed or not succeed, or you can't stand a certain character when they show up. And he's done that as well as anyone, especially over the last 30 years.
When does Vivian come in? I don't think I saw her in Perla Loca. It must be later.
No, she is a bit later. It's in the 2000s sometime, I think.
She's mostly in Volume 5. You get a peek of her at Volume 4. But she's hilarious. She's the most incredible, bizarro, insane character. And you've met her in your life at some stage, and avoided her and not been able to avoid her and various things. But you know exactly who she is, and when she shows up as a character,
Yeah, well, I felt like that about some other characters. Sorry, like Maya. Maya is such a distinct type. You feel like you've met her or you've seen her on TV or something. You just know exactly who she is. Yeah.
No, I think that's true. And what's another nice thing that he does is if you think of Vivian the Frogmouth as she's kind of an analog to Penny Century in certain ways. And it's not that they're the same character, but I think we all kind of have that experience too, in that we have people, not only different people come in and out of our lives, but sometimes a new person will play the role the old person kind of played in a group or in, the way we react to things. So I think I think that's purposeful on his part, that he kind of has these characters kind of play those roles over and over again too.
Tom, what do you think of the wrestling stuff? the Whoa Nelly stuff especially. Like, there's long tracks of wrestling, and I've heard people kind of who have not enjoyed it. I wanted to know what your take was on it.
Well, I kind of enjoy that stuff just because that's not something that I have a deep interest in, even though I kind of like the history of it. Mm-hmm. I think it was, the one way to look at it would be kind of as a transition between the early fantasy stuff and the more modern serious relationship stuff, because wrestling kind of exists in that world between kind of fantasy and reality. So it's almost kind of like a bridge story technique between dinosaurs and gang violence to make it like the most blunt comparison possible. So I kind of appreciate that about it. He really likes drawing that stuff. And, in fact, if you want to take it, if you like, Whoa Nelly is kind of a kind of another example of that, because he does kind of go back in the Love and Rockets stuff and retell some of the wrestling stories. But Whoa Nelly's an all ages book, honestly, and it does kind of keep the fantasy of the wrestling stuff kind of alive. And so I think that's what appeals to it, about it to him. That I can understand how that specific setting would, people would dislike it. I could understand, like maybe the punk rock stuff at first, people kind of might not care for that as much, but I kind of consider it all as a piece. Why not?
Sure.
Come on, wrestling. Who doesn't like wrestling?
Well, it's the wrestling stuff, because when you get to the Volume 4 wrestling stuff, which you haven't read yet, Tim, I mean, there's just pages and pages of silent wrestling sequences. And it's not even like moment to moment. It's just like snapshots of these wrestling matches. I found it was the weirdest, not bad, just the most different from everything else in the books, even though it featured characters that were regular characters, usually from the cast. Just bizarre. Came out of nowhere to me. But he obviously loves wrestling and loved drawing it. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of there's some crunch, I think, to the kind of the fake wrestling storyline he's kind of come up with over the years. And one of his major kind of through lines or thematic through lines, I think, is about the futility of violence.
Yeah.
And how sometimes and kind of from two angles. One, that a lot of violence is silly, but also that a lot of violence is tragic and seems inevitable. And I think kind of wrestling kind of speaks to, you kind of gives him a way to comment on kind of the silliness of violence. There's or kind of both of those themes. I mean, there's a horribly depressing moment where Bull Marie, I think it is, dies in front of Rena, and basically talks about, when she beat up the last person, that it's just like this enormously depressing, horrible moment about, you kind of made you think about kind of living your life in these violent terms. And I think it gives him a chance to comment on those things, sure. But, mostly I think he just likes it.
I assume he's a wrestling fan, otherwise he wouldn't put that in.
Oh.
Yeah, old school wrestling, I think, for sure.
Yeah.
I know that Gilbert has done a story about, actual wrestlers. He did a Adrian Adonis story in one of the first dozen or so issues of Love and Rockets. But Jaime's kind of kept it to this fictional world. But yeah, it's one of the odder aspects of it for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't think of very many comics that have had wrestling in them, other than I can think of one or two comics that are basically about wrestling. But
well, most mainstream comics are wrestling. I mean,
that's true.
A comic, there's really no difference between the two.
That's true.
Just throw in some All My Children, and it's basically the same.
And one of the things that's kind of that you have like rock music, and you have wrestling, and you have these elements in Jaime's work, is that I think it kind of helps put them in the special place, or the special place they have in the heart of comics fans, which is not, they're not doing a lot of the concerns of the stories are very human, very everyday concerns. There's nothing really arch or super arty or super obtuse about the comics they do. They're direct soap operas, and they aren't, the biography of a 17th century artist that no one's ever heard of but them. They're about, things that people encounter in everyday lives, and kind of, and another way to look at it is kind of the culture of Los Angeles, and that stew of cultures that Jaime came up in the late 70s, and where all these kind of, all these art forms were kind of denigrated, like comics and wrestling and punk rock, and he wanted to do the stuff that, comics about the stuff that was around him.
What is Maggie's name, actually? She's introduced at some point as Margarita Luisa Chescarillo, and then her family is calling her Perlita or Perla, and then at some point, it's in the Perla and Beatrice story, she says Maggie was a joke name. And it just kind of stuck, and it's like, oh, well, then her real name is Perlita, but I got confused about that.
I think it's Margarita Luisa.
Okay.
And I think that the Perla is what her family called her, and Maggie was the shortened version that the one mechanic called her that kind of stuck. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of a nice, idea, and kind of, she doesn't really know who she is either, so why not have her name kind of change in the different settings she's in, and to different people, the people that always leave Maggie behind. Poor Maggie.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to say about poor Maggie. Like, don't you feel like she? Well, I haven't read issue 4 of the new stories yet, but I felt at the end of Love Bunglers in number 3, like, can't we make her a bit more happier or self-aware, or realize that she's in a better place than she is? I just felt like, I felt like she was sad, and I felt like she doesn't deserve to be. I didn't know why Jaime did that to her.
Well, I think the long-running story of her is these kind of feelings of loneliness and being abandoned that she has, that a lot of people have. Because, she was abandoned by her family a couple of times.
Yeah.
First by her father, and then by her mother and her sisters. And then, of course, one of the great storylines is the preceding the Wigwam Bam storyline, where Hobie just kind of takes off one day. So there's always people kind of leaving her behind, and how she kind of copes with these these feelings of abandonment as kind of her story. And I think you'll be very pleased with the fourth issue. I won't say anything other than that, but there is definitely, if this is where if we never see those characters again, I think that he has provided, not the answer, but there's a place where I think that it's very satisfying for long-term readers and where she ends up.
Okay. I might go buy it today.
It's all about fan service. It's all about fan. No, I'm kidding. But I think that I think he's very attuned to that. I think he's very attuned to those kind of feelings in her, and he knows that character really well. And what a weird kind of It used to be that cartoonists drew characters that looked exactly like himself, like Toth, and all Toth's characters looked like Toth. All the heroes did, and now you have this cartoonist and that character. It's kind of a strange relationship there.
Mm-hmm.
So, what would you advise somebody like I was who hasn't read any of this stuff? Like, should they start at the beginning? Should they just kind of jump in wherever?
I would. I think if you have the choice, and you have to remember, like 20 years ago, that wasn't an easy. Sometimes that wasn't an easy choice to make. I do like those books that you read. I like those small collections, and I didn't want to like them. I thought that was a terrible idea because they always had very handsome kind of trade collections that were more mirrored to their magazine style format, that I thought were very effective. And I do like these new collections, and I think reading them from the beginning, if you have a choice, is probably the way to go. There's one issue of the first volume, I think it's issue 26, which is 4 short stories by Jaime in completely different styles, and Gilbert's story about Frida Kahlo, which I think is a pretty phenomenal single issue to pick up if you're just looking at back issues and want to pick up a single issue. But yeah, there's really no easy way to get into them. I think you either start at the beginning or start where it pleases you, and the nice thing is, I think we can admit it's not always, all work is not for everybody. I think it's excellent work, but some people just might not get it, or might prefer a different kind of story. But yeah, just kind of wading in, I think, is abandon all hope, you who enter here. And it's very daunting, but I think it's well worth the trip if you get into it.
Yeah, like I said, some of it I like better than others, even though it's all the same creator. I mean, and it's not even a consistent line because my liking of it kind of went up and down as I went through it. The third volume I was pretty much up. Perla La Loca, I think I liked it all the way through.
Sure.
But yeah, the first 2 volumes it was kind of up and down. So yeah, you kind of just have to find the parts that you like, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that it's very different if you've read those stories for a very long time. How it's difficult to recall how astonishing they were in the context of the comics that were coming out at the time. That they were doing stories about, like some of their stories. There was a story that Jaime did in the first issue, like How to Kill Her, which was very an Izzy story, an Isabel story, which was very kind of visually striking and beautiful. I always thought that cartoonists like Jaime, you could always tell like how ahead of their time a bit they were by the kind of cartoonists they were compared to. And they were very, they very much stood alone in terms of the kind of, they kind of dragged or pulled kind of an industry with them. And so at the time there was so little that was like that on the stands. I think it's hard to remember that some of the stories got better later on, or Jaime got better as a cartoonist later on, because it was kind of so much different and so very, in ways, better than a lot of the material that was coming out at the time.
Tom, I was wondering if you had any insight on this. The Wikipedia entry for Love and Rockets said the first issue was self-published in '81, but by '82, Fantagraphics had already picked it up. I was kind of a little surprised that it got picked up that quickly. Do you have any idea of the background there?
Well, I do. I do know that they just kind of, they were looking. It was kind of a timing thing. They were looking to publish more material. The first book that Fantagraphics published was something, it's like a science fiction saga from a guy in the neighborhood. So they didn't really enter into comics publishing at Fantagraphics with any kind of grand ambition. They kind of fell into it, but they started sort of looking around for stuff, and I think that they were just, Gary in particular was very, very taken with that first issue, and they had sent it to him famously kind of as a joke. They just kind of figured that those were the meanest guys out there, and if they were going to get a really negative review, they might as well get it from those guys. So they sent along that issue, and I think they were surprised when they came back and wanted to publish it. But in a way, Fantagraphics, like them or hate them, they have a very unique kind of perspective or kind of role in art comics and comics for adults and the alternative comics movement, in that they were kind of arguing for a comic that didn't really exist when they started arguing for it. So when Love and Rockets, the first issue, showed up, even though it was a lot of dinosaurs and it was bug-eyed monsters from Gilbert, and didn't have a lot of the elements that Love and Rockets had later on, they were kind of waiting. They were kind of primed for, more North American cartoonists to kind of follow their own, gens like that. So I think it was very much just kind of a, hey, we want to publish comics, and then all of a sudden, in the mail, this is exactly the kind of comic we want to publish. It was almost a fate or fortune in that way. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been a pretty good relationship for them over the years.
Can we use that to seg into talking about how the format has changed into what it's changed into? Because when we were setting up this episode, at first we were going to have you on and we were going to talk about various industry concerns. It just was so depressing to me. I thought, let's just talk about Love and Rockets. But we do have to come around to the depressing thing of, why the hell are we down to one issue a year? Like, what the hell happened to the direct market?
Well, originally, it's also worth noting that originally they were a magazine-sized comic. The first 50 issues, Volume 1, were published, and that was a very popular format at the time. ElfQuest, the first volume of ElfQuest, was probably the market leader, but certainly things like Star Reach and early kind of overground comics, a lot of them were published in that format, and I think it was probably reminiscent of heavy metal. It was kind of you had and it was also to show off the art. You had a bigger comic and you showed up the art. But certainly through the 80s, there were a lot of comics that were published that way. Neat Stuff, Peter Begg's kind of a one-man anthology was a comic that Fantagraphics published like that, and it kind of had its own place in the comic store. There's usually like the comics rack, and then there was a magazine rack that had the oversized comics.
Okay.
By the time they got to issue 50, really no one was doing that anymore. They all wanted shelf space was very much at a premium. In the early 90s, the mainstream companies in particular really started to kind of drive a lot of comics off the stands. There were too many comics for the shelf space that were out there, and so just to have any chance of getting in the comics racks at all, it was thought that a smaller comic might be better. They originally canceled Love and Rockets, I think, that after that first volume, just because of the different speed of the two brothers.
Right.
That were doing most of it. Mario, of course, did comics at one time, but really it was just Gilbert and Jaime at the point where they quit. And Gilbert's much faster than Jaime, and I think that he wanted to work at a different rate and publish more comics at that time. So they kind of went off in this direction where Jaime was doing Penny Century, and and Gilbert was doing a New Love, I think, was his first one. He did a couple other comics and kind of published at their own speed. What brought them back together is I think they found that comic shop ordering was once you got rid of a title and you brought in new titles, there's just an automatic reflex in the comics market at that time that, okay, that comic is no longer being done, I'll just stop ordering that comic. There was a lot of comic ordering just by attrition, just by, I've ordered it since 82, I'll keep on ordering it, and then when it's gone, it's like, okay, I can order more copies of, whatever, Rob Liefeld and Dan Fraga were doing or at the time or whatever. But so I think that there was an idea that the Love and Rockets name would be a better name for them to come back. So they did a volume 2, which was 20 issues, all in comic book size.
Yeah.
And I think they just found, that in the late 90s and early 2000s, alternative comics really started to die. And I think part of that is that the graphic novel format was a better one financially for a lot of people. And I think that just for, it's just there are better margins for the publishers. And I think that just as it was one of those things where, like an alternative comics fan who went to the comic shop, needed to go to the comic. If they wanted these people to go to the comic shop, there had to be a certain number of comics coming out. That you could have 2 or 3 every week when you showed up. And when Dan Clowes decided to go into when different people started slowing down or going in different directions, that kind of really chipped away at the number of fans of those books that went in and bought those kind of comics. And Fantagraphics had a very good has had a very good relationship with Norton, their book distributor. So they kind of wondered if that wouldn't be a more effective way to kind of put their stories together. And I think that it's just kind of the way the market's developed and them trying to find a place for these guys in it. I think they, I don't know what their personal preference is, but I think it's just kind of, we want to find the best place. Now, someone like Brian Hibbs, the retailer in San Francisco, will talk your ear off about how this is shooting themselves in the foot and they're not getting as many orders this way. But I think they're pretty happy with the placement of the new kind of volume, and I think they're pretty happy with the sales numbers on them. And I just think it's the way that the industry has developed, from various formats to kind of rigid format to not much care outside of the superhero realm in any significant way, or fantasy books, period, the kind of loss of the alternative comic book. I mean, if you look back at some of those books like that were selling in the 80s before the black and white bust, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle post, all these black and white books that were kind of awful and rip-offs of that. You see guys complaining about selling, 16,000 copies of a book or something, or 8,000 copies of an alternative comic book. And by the late 90s, they would have, killed someone. They certainly would have killed, someone at the comic shop just to have that many comic books in circulation. So it really did just the industry kind of changed underneath them. And, Jaime endures, Gilbert endures, but they, have always been trying to find the best way to capitalize on their work. And of course, what saved them is backstock, because you still have guys like Tim that are buying comics that Jaime made in 1981 today. And that's enabled them to keep a career and to keep a home and to keep at it. But yeah, I think it's just the industry that changed while they kind of kept going.
I felt like there was a little bit of I can't remember whose interview I was reading, but I felt there was a bit of frustration about having to go with a longer format instead of more periodical. But it seems like, at least by issue 3 with the Browntown and Love Bunglers, he mastered it, within 3 years. Jaime knew exactly what he was doing.
I had the same thought. If he had separated Love Bunglers and Browntown into 2 different or 3 different issues of the comic book, I'm not sure it would have hit as hard as it did having those 2 serials split by the 2 Love Bungler stories split by Browntown. So yeah, it's really kind of worked out to their advantage. I agree with you on that.
Okay. Any other points we need to hit?
I'm just really happy to talk about these guys, and just kind of like what I said at the beginning. It's just, if you look at the entirety of Jaime's career and the length and breadth and depth of the comics that he's done, it's a really nice. I'm kind of grateful to have read them, and I don't know that I can say that about too many comics. I think they're really unique, kind of powerful American artists, and certainly Jaime is probably my favorite.
And I think we should add too. We haven't really talked about the art very much, but it's complete sorcery. It's amazing the way he's able to melt blacks into each other and just create shapes out of nothing. I couldn't believe it sometimes. I just could not believe what he was doing on the page. It's just unreal. Complete sorcery. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he's marvelous with the blacks. And there's something that, in his page designs, the way he spots the blacks are very powerful in kind of directing your eye where to go, where to stop, where to linger. And I think that just comes naturally to him at this point, and that's a really astonishing talent to have.
Yeah.
So we can all hate him a little bit too, I think. It's kind of cool because Jaime's one of those cartoonists, and he's such a nice guy. And I've had people from all over comics tell me, there's a story that the Hernandez brothers tell, all of them, about trying, walking up and trying to talk to Jack Kirby back in the days where you could do that at a convention. And Jaime is one of the few cartoonists that I hear from other cartoonists, anywhere from someone like, that works in alternative comics, but even superhero guys. Matt Fraction, the writer, told me this once, that it's just one of those guys you just are kind of stupefied to meet because of the talent and the achievement involved. And I think that they still have that respect from their fellow cartoonists.
Yeah.
And Jaime in particular.
Love and Rockets is published by Fantagraphics. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode there or drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. That's also the address for submitting your own comics work for possible inclusion on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Next week, the three of us are back with a discussion of Gilbert Hernandez's books, Heartbreak Soup, Human Diastrophism, and Beyond Palomar. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.